Hello and welcome to SBK Unplugged, Sheldon Bosley Knight's Land and Property podcast. My name is Kate Gould and I'm the host of the show. Today I am in the studio with our Associate Director and Head of our Planning and Architecture Department, Natasha Blackmore da Silva. Nice to see you again, Natasha. Before we get started, I would like to say a big thank you once again to Mill Street for hosting us in their lovely studio. Thank you very much, guys. So, Tasha, today we're going to be talking about the Biodiversity Net Gain, and which was introduced about a year ago, and the impact it's had on your sector. But before we sort of get into the nitty-gritty of it, I thought it might be helpful for you to sort of just explain what it is.
So Biodiversity Net Gain, usually known as BNG for shorthand, is a piece of planning legislation that was brought in as part of the Environmental Act in 2021. The main idea is that we have to find a way to improve habitats whilst developing the site. And the government have created a standard of a 10% uplift from what is already on site as a requirement for developers. There are a few exemptions to that rule: self-build, custom build, householders, anything permitted under sort of permitted development rights like Class Q or Class R, and also very small sites where less than 25 square metres of non-priority habitat is going to be affected. So potentially brownfield sites or conversions outside of permitted development would also fall into that category. But in most cases, BNG is a requirement that developers, house builders have to find a way to get their heads around going forwards and really have that be part of the project from the beginning.
Right. And so when it was first sort of mooted and then introduced, what was the reaction? Was it well received broadly, or were there kind of a few grumbles?
I think it was well received broadly as an idea, but I think very quickly people realised that questioned how are we going to actually do this. So ecologists, environmental groups, like, this is brilliant. You know, we've been not quite decimating, but we've been affecting our habitat, our natural habitats for so many years as we've been developing, especially greenfield spaces. We need more housing, so we need to find a way to get that housing uplift we need, but at the same time try to protect the natural habitats that are already on site or improve them in other places if we can't. But very quickly it became, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to resource this? Where's the money coming from? How does this actually affect what we do on site? So I think from the initial, when it was just first brought up, to being, this is a really good idea, let's get biodiversity in it from the very beginning, let's create some really nice green spaces. Very quickly the logistics, I think, took over, and it became, oh my goodness, how are we going to be able to deal with this going forward, and how is the construction sector going to be affected?
And so with that in mind, a year on, what do you think has sort of worked well in the generally speaking, given those sort of concerns, if you like?
I think the main thing is that we are getting sites that have got biodiversity and improved habitats on, which was the main idea for the legislation. And people are, developers, applicants, individuals who are developing their own land, they are thinking about it from the outset, which was always the point. A lot of the time previously it became almost something at the end. You did your development, you got everything you wanted on your site, you designed your scheme, you got your houses, and then at the end you went, oh, we'll just put a little sprinkle of biodiversity, we'll add a few trees, we'll add a pond. And now it's part of the conversation from the very beginning. Sometimes even before you work out how many houses you get,
Oh, really?
You're looking at your baseline, what is actually there, how can we achieve 10%, because they prefer it to be on site rather than off site if possible. And then that affects the whole process going forwards. So from that perspective, that's really worked well, because that was the main idea. Then you go back to the logistics again, and we have issues with resources, which everybody said, the RTPI, RICS, even other MPs were saying that a lot of the councils do not have the resources to deal with this increase in information and data that they'll have to process. A lot of local planning authorities, for instance, don't have ecologists in-house.
Right.
So you're submitting something to them that the case officers aren't completely trained to process. It's not their area of expertise, which is fair enough, which is why we have experts on hand to deal with these things. Highways have also always been involved, drainage consultants. We know our limits as planners, so we know who we need to go to deal with that. But if you don't have an ecologist, or you've got one ecologist in a big council trying to deal with hundreds of applications, it causes delays.
Yeah.
And that was never really dealt with. It was mentioned from the very beginning, what do we do about this? How are we going to fund this? And it never really materialised any general, any legitimate way of doing it. So applications that could be 8 weeks, 8-week applications, just a minor application for 4 houses, for instance, because of BNG, potentially are taking 3-4 months to get a decision, depending on how the council interpret it, how quickly they can get an ecologist to look at it, and then how they make the decision to deal with it going forward. There's no consensus that every council has to deal with it the same way.
Right. Gosh, yeah. So there have been some sort of successes in theory and perhaps in practice, but there have been clearly some major challenges to be overcome. Was there anything else that kind of either cropped up that people hadn't anticipated as being a challenge that presented itself, or was it just the overall lack of resource that was necessary, like you say, to have an ecologist or somebody who knew what they were looking at within the council setting to help approve or not approve the application?
I think a big thing is that it came in too quickly. Not BNG itself. We knew for quite a while, obviously 2021 it was originally mentioned, we knew it was happening. But the way the government did it is they went, okay, major applications from February 24, major applications, you have to do BNG. And the idea was that they would get councils sort of used to the system, used to having BNG, used to writing the legal agreements or the conditions to deal with that, and then smaller sites would come on afterwards. We initially thought smaller sites, that'd be a year. They'll give them a year, see what works, and then come back in. Smaller sites came in on the 2nd of April. So that was 2 months in between. And suddenly the councils are not only are they dealing with something, they're now having to deal with it on pretty much every application.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more difficult to do BNG on smaller sites anyway. So you've got, on a small site, say 10 to 30 houses, you're dealing with your BNG. You're also dealing with affordable housing contributions. You're dealing with community infrastructure levy, as well as public open spaces and making sure you've got the right housing mix. There's a lot to fit into a small site. And we're finding that BNG is not possible to do the whole 10% on site. Otherwise the site isn't viable.
Yeah.
So, okay, well that means we've got to do something off-site. So we've got to offset or we've got to buy credits. And that's where the difficulty is. If you can do something on site, it's actually quite a straightforward process. Either they put a condition, the council put a condition at the end saying you must do it in accordance with your BNG plan. Fine. Or they'll do a legal agreement if it's next door to the site saying you've got to fund this, you've got to maintain it for 30 years, and this is how the process works. So you come up with a plan to do that. That's quite straightforward. That can be done with the council, with the case officers. But as soon as you start having to do things outside of that, and it's no longer within that specific area with a few individuals, more people are getting involved, it becomes much more difficult. Where are we getting this land from is one of the biggest issues. Land availability for BNG, for larger BNG sites that people can buy credits for. We've got a lot of banks for that. We've got Habitat Bank, we've got Environment Bank, sort of that are more national. But even still, the council want you to do them in local areas. Well, if there isn't a site available in a local area, how do you do that? And it becomes more and more money. And for a lot of these smaller sites, they're actually finding they're not viable. So you've got smaller sites that can't come forward because they just can't meet that need, whether it's monetary or whether it's actually on site. And I think that's the biggest challenge. I think small to medium sites are the ones that are really, really being hit hard by these changes. Much more so than larger sites. You have a lot more space to play with on larger sites. If you're doing really small things, then you're exempt usually anyway, not always, but A lot of the time, it's those ones in the middle. They're the ones that are struggling with it.
And has that been your experience working for SBK in particular with the smaller sites? Have you found that to be your experience?
I think so, and I think it's not just the fact that it's the smaller sites trying to get it on site, it's also how it's dealt with within the council. So I had an application where it was for a very small thing. It was actually just for a new access, but it went over 25 square metres. So it still had to provide BNG, even though it was literally a sort of a hole in the hedge pretty much. In the end, the council said, oh, well, we'll condition it because you can do it on site, but you need to provide us a habitat management and monitoring plan. Fine, so we then had to provide a separate application with additional information, which they then approved. We had another one where they said, oh, we're happy with your BNG, we're just going to condition it, you just do it in accordance with that, you don't need to provide any additional information. Then I had another one for a similar size site where they wanted a legal agreement to show that we were definitely going to do the BNG for the next 30 years. So we've got 3 sites, 2 of which were in the same council, 3 different ways of dealing with the exact same thing. So goodness. From SBK's perspective, it's quite difficult to predict, to advise clients, because it's difficult to predict how the council, that individual case officer in that council, is going to decide to deal with it. So, you know, you can have 2 applications for the exact same thing. One of them conditioned, done, fine, you can start on site. Another one, legal agreement, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, having to get solicitors involved, drafts, going backwards and forwards with the council's legal team. It's just, there's no consistency. So for us as planners to advise clients, we're having to almost give them the worst case scenario and hoping that it's better. Which I don't like to do, and I don't think it's fair on clients to not know ahead of time what the process is going to be. And it sounds quite difficult for you guys who are sort of having to manage all those sort of expectations but not know quite how it's going to go from, you know, what the council's going to come back with, whether it's going to be quite straightforward as it perhaps should be, or whether it's going to sort of throw up a curveball. So it might be quite difficult to plan. I also think that they didn't really give enough sort of training to private sector planners and architects either. There were loads of sort of podcasts and webinars and training that in the run up to that we could join in on and we could watch through, but we spent most of the time watching it, and even the people who were advising us going, well, we don't know this yet, or this hasn't been answered yet, we're waiting for more information on this. So it's really difficult to advise clients when you still don't know all of the details yet. And the thing is, we still don't know. So for instance, the main question we don't know is what happens in 30 years. So the idea is that you've got to maintain these Biodiversity Net Gain sites for 30 years. But we still don't know what happens after that point. So up until that point, if you're providing a site, you get money into that site to help maintain it, for instance. Developers will give you money if you've got a site to do that. Well, after 30 years, can you then plough the site again and start using it? Do you then have to hope that it's become self-sustaining during that time so you no longer have to use it, have to maintain it? Or are you now having to maintain it but not getting any money to do so? And that's going back to the issues with having enough land for BNG on sites. A lot of landowners and farmers are hesitant to bring sites forward for this because, yes, they're getting money in the next 30 years and it's going to be consistent money and probably relatively good money. But what happens after 30 years? Are they losing these fields permanently just for 30 years of income? Possibly isn't worth it for them. And that's still a question that's up in the air.
And of course, by then, there'll be a multitude of different governments that have gone through. So, you know, there are lots of different factors, I would imagine, that are going to be coming into play, as well as, you know, the environmental concerns more kind of globally. So it's going to be a tricky time, I guess. So in terms of your sort of perspective, what do you feel needs to happen now? I mean, what should the government perhaps be doing, considering, you know, who should they be talking to ensure that this is a success, that it should be? Is it just a question of resources or education, or what do you think needs to be done to make sure it's a success going forward?
I think the main thing is they have to talk to the people who are using the system. We've now got sort of over a year's worth of data of people using this system, not just ecologists for the council, local planning authorities. We've got private planners like me, we've got private ecologists who are writing the reports to support the application. There needs to be really just a review, a consultation with us to go, well, how is this process working, what isn't, how can we improve it, because we're the ones who use it every day. So we know what works, what doesn't, and we all have our own ideas. I speak to ecologists all the time, and we all have our ideas of what we could do to make this better going forward. And from day one I said that in a couple of years it's going to be overhauled again, and I think it's going to end up like the community infrastructure levy process. That's what I felt was going to happen. And the more I speak to people, the more they think, yeah, that's what we're going to have to do going forward.
Yeah.
Is really change how we deal with it. So at the moment, it's 10% uplift, fine. But they want that to be preferably on site. For smaller sites, that's incredibly difficult to do, and it sometimes makes them unviable. So I feel like there needs to be some sort of tiered process where there is a possibility to buy credits or to put money into larger sites for smaller developers, for smaller schemes, without there being as much of, I don't want to say a punishment, but because they want it to be on site first, it's almost like you're being penalised if you can't do it on site by having to put in more monetary contributions to make up the deficit.
Yeah.
So a lot of smaller sites, they may be able to do 5-6%. That's still a major uplift.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, you start with your baseline. If you develop it, you actually go to a minus number. So you're aiming for 10% above this. So you're having to potentially go from a baseline, you're minus 20%, say, and you're actually having to go up 30% to hit that 10% uplift. So if you're 6% positive, that's actually still really good. Not quite enough, but for smaller sites, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So you find that with B&G, smaller sites are struggling with it, larger sites finding it a little bit easier, but there doesn't seem to be a method to help smaller sites go through. And my thinking, as a professional working in the system for over a year, is, well, what if we did an overhaul for smaller to medium sites? So when they can provide B&G on site, it's usually marginal little pockets or slithers on the edge of developments. Habitats, they struggle to establish themselves at the best of times.
Yeah.
So if you've got a really small piece that has to be completely cordoned off from everything else because it's not allowed to be affected by humans, how on earth is that supposed to establish and be self-sustaining? It doesn't work. Whereas if you could put all of those little pockets that we've been asked to do so far onto fewer larger sites, a lot easier for the habitats to establish. You'll probably find habitats, especially with sort of birds and sort of bees and other sort of small mammals, they will actually start to come into those habitats. So you'll end up creating more habitats than you initially intended. And then they start becoming self-sustaining. So within that 30 years, you'd be able to stop maintaining them. Whereas a small site that can't work by itself, you're continuously having to put money in, you're continuously having to maintain for something that isn't really benefiting anybody.
Yeah.
So, like I said, going back to community infrastructure levy, this was brought in sort of quite a few years ago now, to replace the legal agreements that we used to have. So previously, you would get a development and go, okay, right, now we have to agree contributions. So for each site, you'd be agreeing housing contributions, public open space, education, maybe affordable housing. And you'd have to do that each site individually. You'd have to argue each point, negotiate each point, and go, right, in the end, this is the legal agreement. That's how much money you have to do. So for some sites, this could delay the process by 12, 24 months even before things can actually start. And then with community infrastructure levy, they went, okay, let's have a bit of a think. There's still some things that have to be dealt with by legal agreements, fair enough. But how about, instead of dealing with it every single site individually, each council can go, right, per square metre floor space, you're paying this fee. So if you do 10 square metres, you're paying that fee times 10.
Yeah.
The money then, everyone knows from the beginning what they're paying, what's going on, what those costs are going to be, so they can factor that into their scheme and their development and their budgets from the beginning. That money goes to the council, and then the council have the ability to go, okay, well, what do we actually need infrastructure wise? And they have this big bowl of money that they can then use for specific things. That works quite well because it gets applications through quicker. It gets houses or developments actually being built quicker because they've not got the years potentially of delays of legal agreements, and it speeds up the process. So what I think they need to do with B&G is something similar, especially for smaller sites, is go, okay, it's not viable to do it all on site. Fair enough. So what we're going to do is per square metre of floor space or per housing unit, this is the fee.
Yeah.
And then that money goes to the council, to some fewer larger sites within the district or close to the district, and that money gets pumped into those instead. It means that housing and developments are moving forward a lot quicker. Resources wise, it's a lot easier for the council to deal with. There's still the process with the ecologist. You still need to write the right reports to see what your baseline is. Fair enough. There's still a way to figure that out. But by having a set fee, everyone knows where they stand.
Yeah.
And it means you don't get marginal little bits on site that aren't going to stain. You get a lot of larger sites that work better. And in biodiversity terms, size does matter.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got a fewer bigger sites, they're going to do a lot better for biodiversity, for climate change, for habitats, than loads of little slivers that people won't even notice are there.
And I would imagine that as well as the cost implications, so if you have less time to do it all, then it's going to cost the developers less, and but also it ensures that the habitat gets established more quickly. And obviously with the climate crisis that we're facing, we need to protect our habitats. That's going to be beneficial for the environment, whether you've got it right next to the site or, like you say, in a bigger site somewhere else. That's got to be better, surely.
I mean, the thing is, there are just so many plates that developers have to deal with. And at the moment, we've got a big push from the government. We need more housing. They want 1.5 million houses in the next 5 years. We have never, even in the 90s when we were really pushing it, we have never been able to do enough housing to hit that target. I think it's more of an aspiration than a target, to be honest. But with all this sort of red tape almost with B&G that we're facing, there is no way they're going to be able to get to 1.5 million houses because it's stalling everything.
Yeah.
So if we can find a way, biodiversity is important, don't get me wrong, especially with the climate change crisis, with everything going on. We need to find a way to do that. I don't think you should be compromising on that, but I think there needs to be a better way so that we can do both.
Yeah.
Because housing numbers are being compromised. Sites, if they have to provide B&G on site, they have to do many, fewer houses have to be built so that there's more space for B&G. And then if you go the other way, so we're getting less houses but more B&G, and then you're having sites where we need to have so many houses and we're trying to find a way to, well, how can we get that 10%? And it's just, a lot of the time, it's not possible to do both. Depends on the size of the site, but it is very difficult to be able to balance those plates. And I think there's a better way of doing it. For instance, in Wales, their B&G policy is slightly different. So instead of having to do 10%, they just have to show a material uplift. So 1-2% is still acceptable. And I think a lot of smaller sites probably could do that.
Yeah.
So if we go, okay, well, you have to do an uplift on site, you've got to have some positive on site, fine. Let's do that, and then the rest of it, let's just have a fee that you can pay, and that will go to the larger sites.
And that would have a material impact, positive impact, wouldn't it,
so.
on the local environment? Even just something.
Exactly, and obviously there will need to be rules. This is not completely a thought out process yet, where those sites can be. So maybe each council have to have so many sites, so much land that could be available for B&G going forward, so that it stays in the area that these developments are in. You don't want sort of the whole of the greenbelt to be B&G land, and then actually where a lot of these developments are going on, there's nothing there. So there needs to be some rules and some structure with it. But if you want to keep housing going forward, you want to keep these sites going, there just needs to be a better way to get B&G involved in that.
Yeah. So there's clearly lots more discussion to have with government and, the local authorities and what have you. Now, when we spoke about this sort of a year ago, you said that it was going to be one of the biggest changes to planning in 30 years and a real shock to the system. Would you sort of still agree with that?
Definitely. It has been a major shock. And the thing is, we knew it was coming, but because there were a lot of unknowns, even when it came into place, people still weren't ready. The councils didn't have the resources, there wasn't the land available, developers didn't know all of the rules, and we still don't know some of it, what's going to happen in 30 years. So we're finding ourselves working with a lot of unknowns every day, and I feel whilst we've got some of the answers in the last 12 months, we haven't got all of them. So this process has not been it's not perfect, no process ever is, but yeah, it was definitely a shock to the system. It's been this massive overhaul that we're still trying to find our way through, and I think councils especially are still struggling to find a way to get these sites through. Yeah, which maybe answers why there's so much inconsistency within councils. And between councils, that council's interpreting the policy in a certain way to try to find a way to get through it the best they can with the resources they have available, without delaying applications for 4 or 5 months at a time. Yeah. But I think we probably need to see it through for another 12 months or so before really we have enough data. We have a lot of applications that have gone in the last 12 months, still don't have decisions. They're still not actually doing BNG on site. So we need another 12 months, maybe even 24 months before we really see how that is physically going to work. Yeah. That seems quite a long time though, doesn't it? It is. Is that... Well, no one said planning was ever a fast process. It's taken, in the last 30 years, it's taken this long to have such a big overhaul. Yeah. And it's now all happening at the same time. Right. We're being asked to do all of these houses whilst doing this, and those two things don't always go together hand in hand. No, a lot of challenges then. Well, I think we need to book you in to come and see me again in a year's time, and we can discuss it, or maybe 2 years' time. But for the meantime, Tasha, thank you so much for your insight. You're welcome. As always, very insightful. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time. Thank you.